In this session we're going to take a look at the shadows and highlights recovery sliders, which to my mind were some of the most important refinements made to Lightroom 4. They really have transformed the way you can deal with a picture that contains a high dynamic range. And as real estate photographers, this is something we're frequently going to encounter, that disparity between the very lightest parts of a room set and the very darkest parts. And I'm not even talking here about the difference between the view through a window and an unlit side of a piece of furniture, for example. Because you can see in this image here, that's a straight on view, I've actually got some very light areas of wall tone here and some quite dark areas in this kitchen area. So in this session I'm going to be showing how you can tackle these difficult situations with the use of these two great sliders. The highlights and shadows recovery sliders can be found in the basic tab in the develop module, and they're part of this bank of controls that can apply global adjustments to our images. And the image I've chosen here is something which I hope will illustrate these sliders quite well. It's a standard real estate shoot, and I photographed into this room, which contains a doorway through to a rather dimly lit kitchen. Now I have used some fill flash here. There's actually a sink behind this wall that you can't see, and I've put a little light stand about this level which goes up to here with a flash head on, and it's bouncing into the apex of the ceiling and the wall that would have been the other side of this wall. And it's done a fairly good job of throwing some light into this upper area of the room. There was literally no room here to get a light in, and as you can see, this area of the room is kind of in shadow. So what I did was overexposed as much as I possibly could to give that area of shadow a sporting chance of recording detail. But of course what that's led to is an overexposed wall tone in the rest of the picture. Now I really like to draw your attention to these numbers below the histogram. As I move my mouse around the image, you'll see them changing. And you see at the moment, when I mouse over this white area, we're into the early 90s. Now I've conducted some experiments, I've looked at my images in print, and I'm pretty sure that if you leave your highlights at anything above 90, they're going to come out as a really blitzed white when they're finally in published use. And I'm far happier seeing those highlights at about between 85 and 90, but not above. So really on this shot I'd like to take those whites down, and I'd also like to raise these shadow areas, which I think are still too dark even though I've had some fill flash in that room. So starting with the highlights, I'm going to use the highlights recovery slider here and move it all the way to the left, so I'm applying a negative adjustment. And as I do so, the detail that was previously just a blitzed white in those wall areas is actually regained. Now it may not seem like very much, but if I mouse over this area, you can see that what was giving me a reading in the early 90s is now coming out at about 86. And that makes a big difference, because this image may well be used as part of a real estate's advertisement in the press, and images that are in hard copy don't have the dynamic range that an image that's viewed on a tablet or a computer might have. So these areas, if I just left them where they were, would have appeared in a magazine or a newspaper as a blitzed out area of white and wouldn't have looked very good. But by ensuring that my whitest areas come down to a manageable 86 or so, that will ensure that I get tonality in the final image. So I've just been able to restore detail to the picture in the highlight areas by using that highlight slider. Now originally what one would have had to do is move the exposure slider down to pull that detail out. I'm working with a RAW file here, I should have mentioned, so there's plenty of detail to be had in a RAW file. I reckon you can overexpose to the tune of about a full stop and still regain detail. But as I move that exposure slider, look what's happening to the dark kitchen area. The exposure slider pulls the entire histogram down, and it's a very extreme adjustment. And what the highlights recovery slider does is it enables you to just preferentially darken the highlight, the lightest areas of the image, so you can see the histogram moving there just in the upper area. Now in practice you might want to do a combination of both the highlights recovery and a little bit of exposure adjustment downwards if your highlights are really screamingly light. But for the moment we're going to confine ourselves to just adjustments using the highlights and shadows. So I'm going to leave the highlights recovery slider at maximum there, And now let's take a look at what we can do for these shadows. So let's go in a little bit and look at this shadow area. And of course I'm going to move the shadows recovery slider all the way to the right and see what happens. As if by magic, I've brought in a fill flash. Now, a word of caution here. You can lighten the shadows with the shadows recovery slider. It seems like the answer to our prayers, but there is a problem. If you use it without too much caution, you're going to lead to the build-up of digital noise. And if I go in 1:1 here, you can see the area underneath the counter. That's what I shot, and there is some tonality in there, which is great. There's something to work with. But if I pull the shadow recovery slider all the way to the right, I'm really going to get quite a lot of noise coming on in there. So I'm going to settle it back a few notches, and let's pull out and see what that's done for the image. I think that's pretty good. So I've gone from there, let's take it up to about 60s or so, and we're getting a nice fill flash effect in that area. Now you'll notice that the histogram is being moved at the bottom of the scale. Again, it's not the same as using the exposure slider. If we use the exposure slider to lighten the image, do you see how the tones at the top of the histogram are all getting pushed off to the right? So the image is getting way overexposed. But by using the shadow recovery slider, let's get that back to 0, it's just lifting the darkest tones. You can also see this in this stool here. It's just lightening those dark tones. So apply a bit of that and you really can make up for those areas where you perhaps weren't able to get some fill flash. But to go back to our issue of digital noise, I haven't applied any noise reduction to this file yet. So if I scroll down here to my details tab, I normally apply about a setting of 25 on my noise reduction, and I don't know if that's showing, but you can see that rather speckled effect on the file disappearing as I apply some noise reduction. So it's a pretty good solution. So what I'm saying here is that you can go ahead and use that shadow recovery slider. Be aware what it's going to do. It's going to raise some of those darkest areas to the extent that the digital noise becomes visible, but that's something that you can fix. So what I've been able to do here is effectively compress the tonal range of the scene just by using 2 sliders. I haven't had to shoot a number of exposures for an HDR script. I haven't had to do manual exposure blending in Photoshop, for example, and I was able to get away with using one single small flash in that kitchen area rather than anything more elaborate. Now in practice, it's unusual that you just use the highlights and shadows recovery sliders in isolation on a file. And one thing I like to do, if I've applied quite a strong positive adjustment of the shadows, is to just move the black slider slightly to the left. And what that's doing, it's just moving the very bottom of the histogram down a bit so that that's restoring a bit of bite to the blacks. There's a danger with too much of a shadows adjustment that we tend to start to lose the contrast of the image. So by just moving the black slider down slightly, you can give it that little bit of bite in that shadow area. Equally, you can find that with a very strong adjustment of the shadows slider, your light tones can start to be affected as well. So no slider really works in complete isolation. And to counteract that, I'm going to move this white slider down slightly. That's just going to take the lighter tones of the histogram, not the very lightest tones, which are the territory of the highlights recovery slider, just those lighter areas. It's just going to pull those down without affecting the shadows. And if I take my reading from that highlight area, I'm down there to my comfortable target area of between 85 and 86. So what we've been able to do here is effectively compress the tonal range of the scene by using the tonality available to us in a raw file. It's rather like having an octave on the keyboard and knowing that there are notes below that octave and notes that are above the octave that are available to us. And by using the shadows and highlights recovery sliders, we've been able to have access to those extra notes. And using them in conjunction with some of the other refinement sliders like the whites and the blacks and the exposure slider as well, we can come up with really quite a nice blend or balance of tones in an image which would have been quite difficult to harness with a single JPEG exposure.